The subcommittee will come to order. Thank you to all the members who are here already. And after recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, witnesses, your prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days in which to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Near the 7th anniversary of the Syrian civil war, we still find ourselves calling for a clear and coherent strategy on the U.S. role in Syria and in helping bring the conflict to an end. The last administration repeatedly refused to engage with any real purpose in Syria, failing to follow through on red lines, and in effect surrendering the field to Russia, to Iran, to Turkey, to dictate Syria's future on their own terms. By now, the reasons behind President Obama's reluctance to take a stronger stance against Iran in the region and beyond, and his desire to reach a nuclear accord with the state sponsor of terror are well known. His Middle East rebalance, or as he famously put it, sharing the neighborhood, no doubt also factored heavily into his Syria policy. Tragically, there has been a disastrous cost of inaction. Hundreds of thousands murdered, millions of refugees displaced, violent turmoil spilling across borders and threatening our allies Israel and Jordan, and Assad now firmly ensconced, exacerbating Syria's political and humanitarian crises. Even worse, the regime in Iran, flush with cash from the nuclear deal and emboldened by the Obama administration's focus elsewhere, has solidified its so-called Shiite crescent of influence from Tehran through Baghdad and Damascus to Beirut, and left a greatly strengthened terrorist group, Hezbollah, on Israel's doorstep. Considering these costs and a clear lack of U.S. willingness to engage, many people were encouraged by Secretary Tillerson's recent speech in which he described the administration's vision for a way forward in Syria. Even if it lacked great detail, at least it was a signal of intent by his administration to engage in Syria. The Secretary laid out 5 broad but commendable objectives: an enduring defeat of ISIS and al-Qaeda, a stable, unified, independent Syria under post-Assad leadership, diminishing Iranian influence, the return of refugees and internally displaced people, and a Syria free of weapons of mass destruction. As many people have noted, accomplishing these objectives would require significant resources that the Secretary failed to commit to or detail in this lofty speech. Without these details, it is difficult to see how we're going to meet the challenges ahead. Our NATO ally, Turkey, who notoriously failed to stem the flow of foreign fighters and cash and weapons across its border for years, is now engaged in operations against U.S.-backed Kurdish and Arab forces in Syria's northwest, forces that have been essential in our fight against ISIS. And Russia, who appears determined to undermine the United States wherever and whenever possible, has both coordinated with Turkey on its operations and commandeered the UN peace process in Geneva, an exercise that was always doomed as long as Russia was leading it. Meanwhile, Iran continues taking advantage of the chaos, leveraging its tens of thousands of militia fighters to displace Sunni inhabitants, manipulate the region's demographics, and consolidate its own territorial gains. Through it all, it is the Syrian people who are suffering the most in what promises to be an extremely difficult rebuilding process. The administration has begun to talk about this process in terms of stabilization assistance, a necessary piece of any strategy. In delivering this assistance, we must ensure that nothing we provide benefits Assad or his cronies, and it may be more beneficial to focus on the kind of humanitarian soft aid that will allow Syrian communities to reduce their dependence on Damascus. With so many challenges and complications, after years of inaction and allowing others to fill the leadership vacuum, we cannot afford another strategy while praiseworthy with its broad strokes, that has missing details, missing commitment, missing resources. Our excellent panel today is designed to provide members with the full spectrum of assessments on the administration's plan, as well as their own understanding of U.S. interests and policy recommendations for Syria, and I'm hopeful that this hearing can provide at least some clarity on a way forward that we so desperately need. And with that, I'm so pleased to yield to my friend and ranking member, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for convening today's hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us. I'd like to take a moment right at the outset to acknowledge a special guest we have in our audience today. Qasim Eid was a victim of the Assad regime's horrific 2013 sarin gas attack in Ghouta near Damascus. Thankfully, he survived, Qasim, but hundreds of innocent men, women, and children did not. Qasim, thank you for being here, and we appreciate your being with us very much. Thank you. Madam Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit
without
Qasim's
objection
statement for the record, into the record. Thanks, Qasim, as well, for being one of the many living witnesses to the barbarism of the Assad regime, who have been brave enough to share your stories with us here. You help the American people and those around the world understand the brutal reality of life in Syria today. 3 years ago, a former Syrian military photographer known as Caesar testified before our committee with tens of thousands of photos documenting the Assad regime's systematic torture and murder of its citizens. We have since passed a bill bearing his name, the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act, to hold the Assad regime and its international backers accountable for the ongoing atrocities in the now 7-year-long war, a war that has displaced more than half the country and killed more than 500,000 people. But this conflict is not only a dire humanitarian crisis, it is a deeply consequential geopolitical conflict, and we cannot ignore the impact of either. The Syrian refugee crisis is destabilizing neighboring countries and creating debates in European parliaments. Thousands of foreign fighters have flocked to Syria. Terrorist organizations like ISIS and al-Qaeda have found safe haven, and foreign powers, including Iran, Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, have all backed competing forces. What may have begun as a civil war has morphed into a complex array of geopolitical power struggles and proxy conflicts. Assad is only still in power today because when he was at his weakest. Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia sent in fighters on the ground and warplanes in the sky. And while this administration has rightly focused on defeating ISIS, we have urgently been asking the administration for clarity on its greater strategy for the future of Syria. As the U.S.-led coalition has liberated nearly all ISIS-held territory, we need to know what comes next. Last month, Secretary Tillerson finally articulated that strategy in a speech at Stanford's Hoover Institute. He set out 5 objectives that the chair referenced. Number 1, defeat ISIS and al-Qaeda. Number 2, ensure a stable and unified post-Assad Syria. Number 3, diminish Iranian influence. Number 4, help refugees begin to return home in Syria. And number 5, prevent WMDs in Syria. These goals are laudable and they are important, but the speech contained little in the way of concrete strategies to actually achieve these goals. And since this administration's rhetoric has been routinely incompatible with its actions, we still need more clarity. I'm obviously not suggesting that this is easy. We have been having some version of this conversation for more than 7 years. We are discussing a crisis that former CIA Director Brennan called the most complex, complicated issue that he ever had to deal with. But I am concerned. I'm concerned that current American policy has left us on the outside looking in. Russia is already filling the void as the new power broker for the future of Syria. Russia, Turkey, and Iran brokered de-escalation zones in Syria that have not been de-escalatory and have disturbing long-term implications. They are policed by the Syrian army with support from the Russian military, Hezbollah militants, and Iranian IRGC commanders. These are the very groups who have murdered hundreds of thousands of Syrian civilians, who are responsible for attacks on Americans, and who are actively fomenting sectarian violence throughout the region. At the same time, Turkish-U.S. relations are on life support as tensions flare over our support for Kurdish groups. Turkey views the YPG Kurdish group that we support as a part of the PKK terror group and has therefore launched a military invasion into northern Syria. This is a dangerous recipe for two NATO allies. So with these confusing and competing elements in the Syria conflict, we are fortunate to have an impressive panel to help us unpack this crisis, help us fill in the void for Secretary Tillerson. In order to achieve his desired end states in Syria, what is actually needed? How can we continue to ensure this complex humanitarian emergency is addressed? What can we on this committee do to hold the administration's feet to the fire to ensure a coherent and a consistent policy in Syria? I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I thank you, Madam Chair. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Kinzinger of Illinois.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here. Mr. Ford, Mr. Lister, not to put the other two away, but you guys have done great leadership on these issues, and I appreciate it, and I look forward to hearing from you. It's going to be a good hearing. Look, this is 100% predictable where we're at right now. We predicted this years ago when this all started. What happens when you put down red lines and don't follow through? What happens? You know, there is a valuable role for the United States to play in terms of overthrowing dictators. Dictators don't work anymore in an era of information because people don't like to be oppressed, despite what some people think. They just don't, and they're going to throw off the shackles of oppression. And in that process, we have an opportunity to help make a world of freedom or to let the Russians come in and do it. And I think, I'm going to speak obviously more when my question time comes up, but I think it is important to note in all of this that Bashar al-Assad, of course, has blood on his hands, and he should be put in front of a war crimes tribunal, if not killed. And secondly, Russia and Iran bear the same responsibility because this man was about out of office and they came in and stiffened his spine and his regime. His regime will fail because dictatorships fail ultimately, but the question is how much blood in between now and then, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Adam. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Madam Chairman and Ranking Member Deutsch, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to each of the witnesses for being here today, for your work on these issues, and for providing your perspective today. Syria has been an unfolding tragedy since 2011, with estimates that 500,000 people have been killed and more than 11 million people either internally displaced or refugees in other countries. The human suffering brought by this conflict has been staggering, and the willingness of the Assad regime and ISIS terrorists to inflict pain on the Syrian people for their own purposes is astonishing. However, I want to use my minute today to highlight the brutal attack that is underway against the Kurdish people of Afrin, and I know the Chairman just mentioned this, in the northwest region of Syria across the border from Turkey. This assault began on January 20th of this year by Turkey, purportedly against Kurdish PKK terrorists. However, it has become quite clear that there has been a devastating impact on civilians, including by Turkish bombing campaigns, as well as by terrorists associated with the Free Syrian Army. I recently met with Dr. Idris Othman, a constituent of mine from Rhode Island, who is originally from Afrin, who provided pictures and reporting directly from the field where he himself still has family who are under threat by these attacks. And I asked Madam Chair, unanimous consent that this report, compiled by the Kurdish Red Crescent in Syria, be submitted for the record. I urge my colleagues to take the time to review these documents. The images are chilling. We cannot stand by on the sidelines as these atrocities continue, and I hope that we can work together, Madam Chairman and Mr. Deutsch, to bring light to the situation of the Kurdish people in Afrin and ensure that the United States is engaged to protect civilian lives and convey to our NATO ally Turkey that they must abide by international norms and conventions which require that they protect civilians and allow humanitarian and medical assistance. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Wagner, we've had two excellent opening statements, so I don't want to put the responsibility on you to carry the tradition, but you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Welcome, witnesses. And thank you for drawing attention to the ongoing crisis in Syria. I am beyond disheartened to hear reports of the Assad regime's continued use of chemical weapons. Last week, the administration announced that Syria is developing more sophisticated delivery mechanisms for chlorine and other chemical weapons, in direct violation of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons Agreement. Last year, the Trump administration conducted an airstrike on a Syrian airfield 2 days after the regime killed innocent civilians and children in a chemical attack. It is imperative that the administration responds with strength and resolve to the latest chemical weapons reports. I thank you, Madam Chairman, and I yield back.
Well, you surpassed it. Thank you very much, and amen to everything you've said. Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member, for having this hearing, to the witnesses for joining us today. Now in its 7th year, a solution to the conflict in Syria remains elusive as President Assad continues his brutal assault on his people. As ISIS is pushed out from territory it controlled, new challenges and seams of conflict emerge. We are not at the end of this story, but only beginning another chapter. Meanwhile, there are 4 countries, the United States, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, vying for influence in the Syrian conflict. Given the severity of this conflict and the impact on the Syrian population, it is imperative that the United States makes its goals clear and shows it is committed to the resources necessary to achieve these goals. A goal without a full commitment is a pathway to failure. What I hope to gain from today's discussion is a clear-eyed assessment of the administration's goals and strategy for the conflict in Syria, and whether the current strategy is leading us down a path of success or a path of failure. I look forward to our discussion, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you so much, and I think that we should tell our colleagues about a wonderful op-ed that appears in today's The Hill with a co-author of, who are those 2 people?
Yeah, I was very honored and pleased to co-author with the chairman a op-ed about the need to protect
Well, thank
elections.
you so much. And, you know, our staffers work so hard in putting these hearings on, and I'm so delighted to introduce our lineup today, because they have so much background and differing points of views and ways that they're looking at this situation. So thank you to all the hardworking folks behind us. But I am delighted. I'm not snubbing the remaining members. They said that they'll hold their fire for the questions. So Ted and I are delighted to welcome back Ambassador Robert Ford, a good friend of our subcommittee, former United States Ambassador to Syria from 2011 to 2014. Ambassador Ford served 37 years in the State Department and the Peace Corps, having been stationed in Algeria, Iraq, Bahrain, Morocco, everywhere. In recognition of his outstanding work and distinguished career, Ambassador Ford has received too many awards and recognitions to name, but including the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award. Thank you for your service, Mr. Ambassador. We look forward to your testimony. Next, Ted and I welcome Faisal Itani, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, where he focuses his research on the Syrian conflict. Prior to this position, Mr. Itani was a risk analyst advising governments, corporations, and international organizations operating in the Middle East. Thank you, Faisal, and we look forward to your testimony. We welcome back Mr. Charles Lister, Senior Fellow and Director of Extremism and Counterterrorism Program in the Middle East Institute. Prior to this, Mr. Lister was a visiting fellow at Brookings Institution in Qatar and a senior consultant to Syria Track 2 Dialogue Initiative. Thank you, Mr. Lister, for joining us again, and welcome back to Dr. Mara Carlin, Associate Professor of the Practice of Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Dr. Carlin has served in national security roles under 5 U.S. Secretaries of Defense, and most recently she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. What a stellar group of panelists. Thank you, Dr. Carlin, for your service as well. We all look forward to hearing your testimony, and we will start with Ambassador Ford.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. It's nice to see you again, and it's nice to see Congressman Deutsch again. I've come down from Vermont to talk to you today, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
This is like the South, right?
Yeah, it's warm here. And it's a delight to be here with the other members of the committee, and I'm really honored to be here with terrific colleagues. It's a great panel. And I think your hearing on Syria is very well timed, because the Syrian war, which has been going on now for 7 years, but it's entering a new phase. It's really in a new phase. And I think it's a great time to look at what's happened and to reassess. So let me just quickly say a few things about the way I look at the Syrian war. First, I think it's time to think carefully about core American national interests in Syria, core American national interests. First, obviously regional stability. We're concerned about the threat that Iran could pose to our friends, notably Israel and Jordan. But I want us to focus on that for a minute. We've left American forces in eastern Syria. The Iranians are in western Syria. Our forces are about 350 miles from the Iranians, and it's not likely the Iranians are going to leave Syria because we have troops 350 miles away. It's a mistake to think Russia is going to push them out. The Russians won't. So I think we need high-level consultations between the United States and especially Israel and Jordan to develop a menu of responses about how to deter Iran, and I'm happy to go into more detail on that. Second core interest, preventing terrorists in Syria from reaching out and attacking our allies or attacking us. We are building up a local security force in eastern Syria. I think it behooves this committee, I think it behooves the Congress. You have received requests for $430 million for this force in the fiscal year 2017 budget request, and you have received another $500 million request in the fiscal year 2018 request. I think you need to ask, what are the benchmarks and what are the timelines for setting that force up? When I was in Iraq 15 years ago and we were setting up Iraqi security forces, with great difficulty, we could never define and we could never obtain the benchmarks and timelines. If we can't, then we are in some kind of indefinite commitment. So I think you must ask for benchmarks and timelines. Third, Congresswoman Wagner mentioned the use of chemical weapons. I think it is important to reestablish deterrence against Syrian government use of chemical weapons. But we also must understand the Russians are going to veto anything we try at the United Nations. Whatever steps we take to deter come outside the United Nations Security Council. Fourth core interest. It's less of a core interest, frankly. Ideally, we would see a better government in Syria. It's a low bar with Bashar al-Assad's government. See a better government that respects human rights, that can be held accountable, and that treats refugees well. I noticed that Secretary Tillerson said American forces will stay in Syria until there is a national political agreement. I have to tell you, I was very surprised to see that. That is a big change in American policy. And I have to tell you, having worked on this for 4 years, long years, the Geneva process is dead. It's moribund at best. And Geneva cannot be some kind of a diplomatic strategy. It's going nowhere. And so I think, again, it behooves the Congress to ask, what is the diplomatic strategy if you want to tie the presence of U.S. forces in Syria to a broader political solution? What is your diplomatic strategy to get to the political solution? Geneva is a city. Geneva is not a benchmark on a diplomatic strategy. Two other bits of advice for the Congress. First, we are now engaged in a stabilization effort in eastern Syria. I have to tell you, I don't really understand the difference between stabilization and nation building. I think the Congress needs again to ask for better definitions, benchmarks, and timelines. And finally, on refugees. The refugee situation is terrible. It's desperate. I think we need more resources devoted to refugees, especially communities in places like Lebanon and Jordan. We don't want those refugee camps to become future recruitment grounds for extremists. But I'm going to conclude with this last thought, Madam Chairwoman. I think it is time to reconsider whether or not we continue to fund United Nations humanitarian assistance programs inside Syria. Bashar al-Assad is gaming the system. He is blocking aid to desperate communities in opposition-held areas, the few that are left. And we are basically subsidizing Assad by funding the United Nations humanitarian aid programs. I think that, too, needs a real reconsideration. Madam Chairwoman, thank you very much. I look forward to a good discussion.
Wow, you ended with quite a bombshell over there. Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Itani. Thank you, Faisal.
Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee, I'm honored by this invitation to speak to you about the way forward for U.S. policy in Syria. Now, you have my written statement already, and it's quite detailed. What I'll try to do now is bring out some of the key points I want to get across, after which I'm very eager to hear, of course, your questions and feedback. I personally believe that the 5 goals mentioned by the administration are valid goals, they're worthy goals, but I also believe that, with the exception of one of them, they cannot be achieved through the means that Secretary Tillerson outlined. In other words, I think our policy suffers from a very serious mismatch of means and ends, the shortest way to put it. The stated ends have been mentioned, but I want to repeat them for the sake of my analysis. Number one, the lasting defeat of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, supposedly in all the country, facilitating the return of refugees, depriving the regime of weapons of mass destruction, that's actually what it is, and the last two, which are the most ambitious, which is weakening Iran and Syria, and ending the civil war in Syria by securing Assad's departure from power. Now, to achieve all this, I want to highlight the 3 tools that were mentioned. First tool was a limited U.S. military deployment, whose duration was timed to the achievement of these 5 goals. The second are the stabilization operations, which I presume mean restoring basic security and services. And the third is aggressive diplomacy, and finally a UN-backed election process that would get rid of Assad. Fine. Now, I believe these tools can accomplish one of the 5 goals, which is to keep ISIS down in eastern Syria so long as we're there. After that, I'm not sure what happens. And as for the others, Al-Qaeda does not operate where we are in Syria or anywhere adjacent to us. It operates in areas that are contested by Turkey, the regime, Russia, Iran, and a slate of other actors. And those are things we explicitly said we don't want to get involved in. So much for Al-Qaeda. Large-scale refugee resettlement is not going to happen in Syria without an actual aggressive reconstruction project in the areas we control. Secretary Tillerson has explicitly, and others have ruled that out actually already. Assad is not going to give up his weapons of mass destruction, much less willingly leave power, unless there's a military threat to his rule. Full stop. He's not going to do it through negotiations, and he's not going to do it through elections. Iran cannot really be meaningfully weakened in Syria without a military escalation either. The Iranians are deeply committed, and they have been building assets and equities, including tens of thousands of loyal fighters in Syria over the past few years. Now, the common military thread that runs through this, missing thread that runs through this is military action or military force. I recognize that after 7 years of war, partly because we made mistakes, partly because the situation evolved, that is no longer very feasible or is much more unattractive than it ever was. So if we leave that aside, it means we've set goals in Syria that we actually cannot meet, full stop. And that's a dangerous situation for us to tie ourselves in if we have troops on the ground in Syria and we've committed to those outcomes. Now, one way out of this, if military force is not an option, is to revise the goals. And I believe we should do that at the very least. Those goals should be much more humble. The first goal is to protect the territory we hold. I think the United States government needs to be very clear, and the White House needs to be very clear, that these troops are going to come under attack eventually. We are not going to be allowed to sit down in northeastern Syria as long as we want and dictate the methods and the timing of the conflict. Second is, so long as we're there and we hold this piece of land, we do need to engage in meaningful governance, development, and reconstruction beyond basic needs. Why? Because refugees are not going to come back otherwise, because that is actually a potent counterterrorism tool, if it works and is done right, and because I still believe that there is some value in propping something up in part of Syria that is semi-successful and isn't Assad. I think that still has some value for the long-term future of the country. Goal number 3 should be supporting our local partners against ISIS. And yes, that does include the Kurds that have fought with us, but it also includes, and should include, a more powerful and influential Arab component. And that feeds into what I think ought to be our 4th goal, as difficult and unsavory as it is, which is our restoration of our relationship with Turkey. And that doesn't mean letting the NATO ally do whatever it wants, but it does mean putting serious diplomatic effort into getting involved in the conflict between them and the Kurds and defusing that, and from that point, using that as a starting point for repairing our alliance. Thank you.
Very much. Mr. Lister?
Madam Chairwoman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the committee, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today. Nearly 3 weeks ago, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson laid out a vision in which US interests would be secured by achieving 5 grand objectives in Syria. Unfortunately, his speech raised many more questions than it provided answers. Today, there's simply no available path to achieve the stated objectives, and no actual strategy has emerged. Nearly 7 years of conflict has produced countless threats to American interests, including multiple wars, militarizing hundreds of thousands, fueling terrorism on an unprecedented level, normalizing chemical warfare, sparking huge refugee flows that have crippled neighbors and destabilized Europe. It's propelled Russia back to the Middle East and empowered Iranian expansionism like never before. Contrary to conventional wisdom, Syria is also not winding down. The country remains mired by multiple conflict fault lines, none of which are close to resolution. The intensity of fighting may have receded, but the mechanism used for doing so, known as de-escalation zones, were by Russian design intended to allow continued lower-level violence. As a result, the regime has continued to indiscriminately bomb and methodically recapture strategically important territory, strengthening its hand further. The Trump administration's cessation of support to the entire vetted opposition last summer was a vitally important cog in this Russian design. By lending its support to a Russian initiative designed to strengthen the regime, the Trump administration has directly abetted Assad's survival, Iran's expansion and threat to Israel, and continued civilian displacement. With ISIS's caliphate all but gone, Syria's various root causes of conflict are now re-erupting. Fighting is intensifying and battlefronts are reopening. Within this environment, the US should consider 4 policy avenues. First, northeastern Syria. Here, we must significantly expand stabilization in areas liberated from ISIS. The task ahead is huge and it's already taking too long. We must urgently raise more funds for stabilization and reconstruction, to encourage refugee and IDP returns, to establish a form of governance superior to the regime, and to prevent further extremism. Doubling down here does carry risks. Our SDF partners remain dominated by the YPG, which is unavoidably linked to the PKK, a designated terrorist organization and a direct threat to our NATO ally Turkey. While it might be impossible to sever the YPG's links to the PKK, it ought to be possible to limit its use of PKK symbols and rhetoric and to expel non-Syrians from its ranks. The US should also engage with Ankara and the YPG to negotiate a mutually acceptable détente, potentially within a broader Turkey-PKK ceasefire. The US should also continue to train and Arabize the SDF at ground and command levels. This strategy also risks confrontation with pro-regime forces, who will perceive our troops and the SDF as threats, and against whom they will inevitably seek to conduct repeated probing attacks. The US should respond to these clearly and defensively. Second, terrorism. Although we've dealt a hammer blow to ISIS, it remains active in several areas of Syria. We must sustain our mission and neutralize any signs of ISIS re-emergence. We must also clearly accuse the regime of its shortcomings in confronting ISIS and, where provable, highlight its new role in providing it with space to operate anew. While we fought ISIS, al-Qaeda and like-minded groups have thrived. Former al-Qaeda affiliate HTS now commands roughly 15,000 fighters and dominates the northwest. HTS's focus on localism and controlling territory makes it a dangerous spoiler whose existence presents a safe haven for global jihadists. Alongside HTS, then, is an even more dangerous reality, a tight-knit, covert circle of 200 to 300 veteran al-Qaeda loyalists dedicated to the global anti-West cause. This looks worryingly similar to the al-Qaeda-Taliban relationship before 9/11. HTS's real vulnerabilities lie in its lack of popularity and credibility, so confronting it is about outcompeting its ability to exert ground influence. There are things we can do to better equip locals to sweep the rug from under HTS's feet and to create conditions in which kinetic opportunities may later become available. Third, Iran. Although diminishing Iranian influence is unrealistic, the US can constrain its ability to gain further and contain its threat to Israel and Jordan. To achieve the latter, we should build a network of self-defense forces in southwestern Syria using our pre-existing relations with vetted southern opposition groups. These forces would defend against any Iranian move closer to Israel and Jordan, while also blocking further regime consolidation. We should also continue escalatory sanctioning of Iranian-affiliated bodies and figures involved in illegal and terrorist activities in Syria. Militia groups linked to the Quds Force should be designated and excluded from internationally negotiated ceasefires. We should also consider joining Israel in conducting strikes on flagrant threats or strategic weapons transfers by Iran to groups like Hezbollah. Fourth, chemical weapons. The US has positioned itself as an arbiter and enforcer here since 2013, with mixed record. Continued chemical weapons use must be met with measured but escalatory consequences, particularly against Syria's Air Force and chemical weapons research facilities. More sanctions should also be deployed and further chemical use exploited as leverage within broader political dynamics. To conclude, if anyone believes that Bashar al-Assad is the key to stabilizing Syria, they have learned literally nothing from the country's recent history. Accepting today's status quo will also not stabilize Syria. Trumpeting grand goals without the means to achieve them guarantees failure, and giving up altogether only ensures an eventual need to return to confront the threats that will result. While there is indeed no panacea for Syria, there are options available to protect our existing stakes, to defend against threats, and to shape interim solutions and arrangements that protect our vital interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Carlin.
Chairman Ross-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss Syria with you today. In 2012, 1 year into the Syria uprising, I testified before the subcommittee, and I said the following: the United States knows what it does not want in Syria, but getting to what it does want, the end of the Assad regime, will be messy, difficult, and unsatisfying. The outcome in Syria is not evident today, but I can say with some confidence how it will not end. It will not end with Bashar al-Assad voluntarily stepping aside or choosing exile. It will not end with him making sufficient reforms to enable a transparent and free Syrian state. Let me be clear, continued oppression and violence in Syria will continue. Looking back, it appears that grim assessment may have even been too bright. The situation in Syria today is a tragedy of epic proportions, which can make it difficult to take a sober view. Nevertheless, such a view must acknowledge three crucial dynamics going forward. First, Assad won his war to stay in power. Granted, he rules a challenging, fragile, and fragmented Syria, one where violence will not cease in the coming years, nor will efforts to unseat him. Second, the situation in Syria is a proxy war in a much larger geostrategic game, and any assessments of the dynamics and attendant policy recommendations must take that into account. Much like Lebanon's civil war, a nasty internecine conflict with countless casualties that lasted 15 years, the situation in Syria today is further complicated by a dizzying array of actors pursuing divergent interests in partnership with competing groups. The roles of states like Russia, Iran, and Turkey and their increasing collaboration stand out. And third, the easy part is over. A number of disparate parties involved in the Syria conflict, internal to Syria, regionally and globally, largely agreed that ISIS must be crushed. While in some ways the next phase of countering ISIS, militarily as it goes underground, and politically to ensure a capable successor does not fill its place, will be tougher, this emphasis on militarily defeating ISIS enabled these powers to put tricky issues like reconciliation, rebuilding, and governance on the back burner. So the fundamental debate for Washington today is whether to focus on counterterrorism or broader geopolitical affairs in Syria. In recent years, the United States overwhelmingly and deliberately prioritized Syria as a counterterrorism problem. This narrow focus, by its very nature, informed how the United States conducted its role in the conflict and with whom it chose to cooperate. It facilitated a very successful counter-ISIS effort, but this approach had other implications, namely that the United States effectively tolerated Assad's continued rule and largely condoned Russian and Iranian efforts. My uppermost concern is security. As ISIS continues to lose territory, the battle space in Syria is shrinking, increasing the risk of confrontation among entities there. The U.S. military's mission in Syria has been alternately described by senior U.S. officials as presence and focused on bringing stability, dangerously vague terms. Is it focused only on finishing the fight against ISIS? How much will it go after al-Qaeda remnants? To what extent is it there to push back on Iran? To fight the Assad regime? To train, equip, and advise violent non-state actors as they seek to do so? What about the Russians? Like the U.S. Marines sent back to Beirut in 1982 with a similarly unclear mission, the residual U.S. force presence in Syria may be just enough to get us into trouble, but unlikely to accomplish very much. We need clarity, not just for the American people, but frankly, for our adversaries, our competitors, and our partners in Syria too. Whom is the U.S. military willing to fight? For whom is it willing to put American lives on the line? Research I conducted for my book, Building Militaries in Fragile States, suggests findings that are translatable to U.S. collaboration with violent non-state Syrian actors. Efforts to train and equip these groups are fundamentally political, not technical exercises. Building an effective fighting force requires more than supplying training and equipment, which has been and will continue to be insufficient to meet our declared political goals. A narrow approach, distance from key political issues, wastes time, effort, and resources. It is fundamentally flawed. These forces depend heavily on legitimacy, so transforming them requires the United States to become deeply involved in their sensitive military affairs. Supporting violent non-state actors in Syria requires U.S. policymakers to have a clear-eyed assessment of the goals and likely outcomes of U.S. military assistance. Simply put, the United States must be cautious of our tactical and operational actions driving policy and blinding us to the geostrategic picture. As the subcommittee's members examine the way forward in Syria, I urge you to ask the following questions of the Departments of State and Defense. Does U.S. policy towards Syria prioritize counterterrorism or larger geopolitical challenges? What is the U.S. military doing in Syria? Why and on what basis? What is its mission, rules of engagement, red lines, and how are these being communicated to Russia, Iran, the Syrian regime, Hezbollah, and other violent non-state actors, including U.S. partners? And what is the nature of the U.S. military's relationship with and commitment to violent non-state actors in Syria? In conclusion, I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Carlin, and thank you to all of our excellent panelists. And we will begin the question and answer period of our hearing. And our side will begin with Mr. Mast of Florida.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Some great comments from all of you. Great analysis on the unlikelihood of a peaceful transfer of power from Bashar al-Assad. And that's where I want to begin, is from that point. Assuming we could get to that point at some time in the future, what would it take to have a post-Assad Syrian government that would back U.S. regional policy goals in the Middle East, that would back support for Israel, that would oppose Iran, that would oppose Hezbollah? This is open to any of you. What do you think, what groundwork do you think we need to be laying in place for that? Don't all jump at once. I will ask Dr. Carlin, because I thought you had a great analysis, and I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. You're asking a really difficult question. I think that's why you met some looks on our side. Look, 6-7 years ago, when this conflict broke out, this was a real point of debate. A lot of people said maybe you could just push Assad to the side. People around him might have a different vision for Syria. As I noted, was rather skeptical, as were potentially some of my fellow panelists. Bottom line, you're talking about not just taking Assad out of the picture, and that is not going to happen willingly, but everyone around him. I think the vision that you're outlining is what one should aspire to, but it is decades and decades off. And were I to think about policy prescriptions to try to get us there, they would probably start with kind of very local state-building enterprises.
So I want to move just a little bit in that direction of getting to that goal. and ask if you could look at the forces that are operating throughout that region, whether it be Iran, whether it be Hezbollah, whether it be the Assad forces, whether it be Russia. How would you rank them in terms of threat against the United States of America, and which one of those dominoes would you look to be knocking on first?
Thank you for the question. To start with, the kind of Syria you're talking about, one that would be friendly to Israel, hostile to Iran and Hezbollah, the quick answer to that is any Syria that arises out of a political deal with the opposition is not going to be friendly to Hezbollah and Iran. Definitely not. That's the easy part. For it to be friendly to the Israelis, I don't think there are any Arab countries that, as such, are really friendly to the Israelis. Maybe Jordan, to a certain extent. Syria is not going to be that way, but and it doesn't mean it's going to be part of the Iranian regional chessboard and strategy and a front line against the Israelis like it is right now. I think the Syrians are preoccupied and will be preoccupied with other things, to be honest with you. So that's my my quick answer to your question.
Congressman, let me just directly address your question. It's easy for me to imagine that Iranian Revolutionary Guard-backed militias in Syria, as well as Syrian intelligence services, would attempt unconventional attacks against U.S. personnel on the ground in Syria. In fact, I expect it, frankly. They may choose the time based on other issues, whether in Iraq or elsewhere. I doubt very much that the Russians themselves will launch a direct attack on American forces in Syria, but all three countries, Iran, Syria, and Russia, want American forces out of Syria.
Mr. Lister, you spoke a good deal on the Kurds. My question is open to all of you in terms of a more national Kurdistan in its entirety. Do you believe that that would be a draw for Kurds across the region, coming from Turkey into a Kurdistan, coming from Iraq, coming from Syria? And do you think it would draw all Kurds from the region and provide a stabilizing force in terms of centralizing Kurds throughout the region?
And we'll allow just a short answer so we can get to the other panel members.
With time on our side, I'm sure other people on the panel probably want to say something on this too, but I mean, my personal position is, much as the project that has been established in Kurdish majority areas of northeastern Syria has been an attractive proposition to Kurdish populations elsewhere in the region, in Turkey and in Iraq and elsewhere, there are certain nationally unique dynamics that are in place as well. So no, I don't think if the United States or any other country was to establish some kind of Kurdistan in Syria, that it would become something that Kurds from all across the region would suddenly start flowing to. I don't think so. Having said that, it has demonstrated that when there is a threat to certain regions in Syrian Kurdish areas, such as in Afrin right now, we've seen Kurds from Iraq and Kurds from Turkey travel to Syria to defend Afrin. But when I say Kurds, we've got to be really careful here about not generalizing. It's specifically Kurds who are supportive of the YPG and the broader PKK vision for breaking down national boundaries, having no state borders, and launching this new kind of ideological vision for governance. You're not seeing supporters of Kurdish national parties in Iraq, in Turkey, or in Syria joining along with this. In fact, they all stand in opposition to it. So it's not a unifying Kurdish vision.
Thank you, Chairwoman.
Thank you so much. Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for the great testimony. I think I heard unanimous recognition and concern from the panel of Iran's increased role in Syria. And despite the administration's strong rhetoric on Iran, the Trump administration's strategy so far appears to have been to clear territory from ISIS and then, troublingly, to let Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah fill the void. Ambassador Ford, you pointed out that American forces are 350 miles from the Iranians. Dr. Carlin, you mentioned in your testimony that with the help of Hezbollah, Iranian power projection across the Middle East has skyrocketed. You also said Iran has demonstrated an unwavering commitment to its mission in Syria, increasingly purchasing another strategic border with Israel. So all of this is really concerning. One of the objectives for Syria, according to Secretary Tillerson, is to diminish Iranian influence. Mr. Atani, you talked about the mismatch of means and ends. I don't know if that's one place where that's true. And Mr. Lister, you talked about striking weapons transfers, perhaps to send a message. The question is, what should the administration be doing to push back against Iranians' projection of power? And could Syria be co-opted by Iran and its proxies, as we have seen in Lebanon, where Hezbollah has increased its political and military stranglehold on that country?
I would start by answering the latter part of your question, and I would say we're pretty much already in that direction. I'd say one reason why the Russians seem to be rushing their own political efforts is because they realize that on the ground they're fighting a losing battle in terms of the Iranian influence. Without getting too granular, I'd point you to a number of incidents that have happened in the last week or two where the Turkish military, with Russian permission, has entered areas of northern Syria in order to establish a de-escalation outpost. Each time they've done that with Russian permission, they've been attacked by Iranian-backed militias. A very clear divergence here between Russia and Iran on the ground. They are seeking the same objective, but the tactical decisions are different. So I think we're already shaping in that direction. Iran is using the Hezbollah model in Iraq already, and they're doing exactly the same thing in Syria, and I do think that's a danger. Is that something the United States can roll back? No, it isn't. As I said in my oral testimony, I think it's something we can seek to contain. And if protecting Israel is as serious an interest as the Trump administration says it is, then there are certain things that we can do to be able to deter and contain that threat.
Right. So, but what should we be doing? Ambassador Ford, there's obviously much discussion among policymakers about Iran's desire to build a land bridge from Tehran to Beirut, right? Everyone loves to talk about the land bridge. How far are they at establishing the land bridge? You said in your testimony the Iranians don't need a land bridge from Iran to Lebanon. For many years, they just used the Damascus airport. So the question is, what can we do if we're 350 miles from the Iranians? And you suggested that ultimately they pose a threat not just to Israel, but ultimately our troops are likely to be on the receiving end of some sort of attacks by Hezbollah or IRGC. What do we do? What does the administration do to match its rhetoric?
Well, two things, Congressman. First, we need to recognize that short of going all-out war into Syria, and by the way, with a risk of dramatic escalation with the Russians in that process, we're not going to be able to get the Iranians to leave Syria. When I was ambassador there in 2011, there was an Iranian presence. It's much bigger now, but the Iranians have long been there. And they don't need, as I said in my written testimony, they don't need a land bridge. They don't need a road. They fly things into Damascus airport. I don't think it's the policy of this administration to shut down Damascus airport. Were we to do so, it might change the calculations in Tehran. I do think there are two things we need to think
Ambassador Ford, I'm sorry, but I just want to follow up on that. I understand that it's not the policy to shut down the airport. Are there any deliveries that Iran would be making that should, as Mr. Lister suggested, that should prompt our military to take action?
Well, first, more than just us sleeping in, the Israelis often strike themselves. And they've retired Israeli Air Force general commented within the last 6 months after his retirement that the Israelis had struck hundreds of times. So the Israelis are already operating this way. It makes sense to me to have intense, behind closed doors discussions with the Israelis about what they need, because this, after all, is first and foremost their problem. I can imagine a series of things that we could do. That might be, if the purpose is to deter Iran from attacking Israel, then perhaps we should have troops in Israel instead of eastern Syria. Perhaps we need to rethink what kind of peacekeeping force is up on the Golan, separating Israeli defense forces from these militia fighters that we're talking about in the Syrian army. change the mandate of the United Nations force, replace the United Nations force with something else we negotiate with the Russians and with other members of the international community. Maybe we need to do what Charles suggested and set up a proxy force. What I'm saying is that the presence of U.S. forces far away is not going to address this problem.
Thank you, Ambassador Ford.
Thank you so much.
If I may I add something?
And, well, we'd love to hear from you, Faisal, but, you know, we're in recess, but they already buzzed that we're going to be in session in just a few minutes. And we've got Mr. Kinzinger, Mr. Cicilline, Mr. Donovan, Mr. Connolly, Mr. Shabbat, and Mr. Liu. So perhaps if we could keep our question and answer period less than 5 minutes, that would be great.
I'll do my best.
Thank you. Go to it.
First off, again, thank you all for being here. In my opening statement, I said that this was predictable. I kind of lied. I think it's gotten way worse than what we even predicted. We knew it was going to be bad. But I remember back in 2013, colleagues from both sides of the aisle, both sides share blame in this, came and said, we can't do anything in Syria, or it's just going to, look at Libya. And frankly, as bad as Libya is, it's better than Syria right now, sadly. But we're in the 6th year of this now, and Mr. Ambassador, I'm sure you're obviously very familiar with the number of refugees, and one of my biggest concerns, I think when we look at, it's entirely possible in 30 years, if you go forward, people will look back at this time period as actually World War III. It'll be a low-grade version of that. It's not like 1 or 2 in terms of the intensity, but it is a worldwide conflict. And one of my biggest concerns is not just alleviating the issue in Syria, that's a problem, but beyond that, it's the 7- and 8-year-olds in refugee camps right now that are seeing a world that's left them behind, that aren't getting educated, that aren't learning, that aren't showed that they have hope and opportunity. And that is the best recruiting ground for the next generation of ISIS or the next generation of Al-Qaeda. They'll be easy recruits, frankly. And so if we look at this as a generational struggle, which I do, I think for the rest of my life we'll be fighting radicalism, we have to, I think, take this issue very seriously. So, Mr. Ambassador, given your experience, what type of impact can we have going forward in Syria and the surrounding countries to ensure that we give these kids a chance at a better life? What kind of programs and stuff? And if you want to keep it fairly brief, I know that's a long question, but I do have one other issue I want to get to.
Very briefly, Congressman Kinzinger, the United Nations and the partner agencies that work with it, whether it be Save the Children or the International Rescue Committee, others, Doctors Without Borders, it's a long list. They can do a lot. They can do a lot if they have the resources. But the resources have been on a downward slope lately. There's an element of donor fatigue. And that's why I said I think we need to increase that assistance to refugees. It costs money, I understand that, but precisely for the reason you mentioned about not having these refugee communities as future recruitment grounds, it has to be done. If the Americans lead on this, we will get other countries to follow.
And I wish we could budget differently, because I think investing in a kid's education is way cheaper than a 500-pound GBU in the future. And let me ask on the chemical weapons. So, on the broader issue, just worldwide holding to counterproliferation, we obviously know the Assad regime destroyed some of their weapons, but I believe they're reproducing sarin gas or using chlorine gas. We know this. I think the president bravely took out a Syrian airfield, but it's not enough. Obviously, it didn't send a strong enough message to Assad and to the Russians that we're serious about this. And, we're finding out that they're doing this again to another extent. So I think we need to bring the full force of the United States and the world community to bear on this issue. And it doesn't mean necessarily overthrowing the Assad regime, though I'd love to do that. But even if we ground Assad's Air Force permanently, crater his runways, take out his helicopters, and make it clear that the delivery of chemical weapons, the cost to you will be far greater than any benefit you can gain psychologically or otherwise, would be good. So both for the ambassador and Mr. Lister, in your opinion, what would be the appropriate response to his use of continued use of chemical weapons in defiance of the president?
Very briefly, Congressman, it's imperative, if we want to stop the Syrian government from using chemical weapons, that we make them feel pain militarily. And targeting the Syrian Air Force is certainly one place where they would feel pain, especially because with their troop shortage, they need air power more than some other governments in their civil wars.
And I think, Mr. Lister, I'll let you answer, but let me just say, I think it's clear. We're not saying if we respond for his use of chemical weapons, we're going to go in and solve the Syrian conflict. We're not saying that. What we are saying, though, is we're going to destroy his ability to violate world norms since World War I. Mr. Lister.
Very much, Adam, but I just worry about...
Go ahead.
Thank you so much.
You owe me 40
You're
seconds.
a gentleman and a scholar. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. As I indicated in my opening statement, I'm very concerned about Turkey's recent attacks in Afrin. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Othman, my constituent, who has been working very hard to raise this issue, who continues to have family in Afrin. And this has resulted in civilian deaths. I've introduced in the record some photographs of children that were struck and killed. It's resulted in the displacement of 16,000 people. And the administration has said very little about this ongoing offensive, and what they have said has been very restrained. And so, Dr. Carlin, I'd like to start with you. Can you speak a little bit about the dynamics here? What is Turkey trying to achieve? Why is the administration allowing an offensive against some troops that we have trained and that have been so helpful in our fight against ISIS? What is the impact of this on our allies' ability to make progress against ISIS? And shouldn't we be doing more to protect Kurdish civilians, and particularly since they have been such great partners with us in this fight against terrorism?
Thank you for this question, sir. For Turkey, Kurdish issues are existential. And the challenge here, of course, is there are two different apertures through which you can view what's going on. You can view it in terms of countering ISIS, right, a very Middle East perspective by which you would say we should work with any violent non-state actor that can effectively weaken ISIS. And indeed, we have seen that the Kurdish groups in Syria are pretty good at this. You can view it through another aperture, which is NATO, counter Russia, Article 5, a much bigger geopolitical view. From that perspective, indeed, as you're going forward, then your cooperation with these groups might actually need to decline. It all depends on which priority. And I think one of the challenges right now, and I would urge as you're speaking to the state and defense departments, that you engage them on this issue, is how do we actually see the Syria conflict going forward? Is it still a counterterrorism problem, or is it a broader problem where we are dealing with Russia, where we are actually looking at issues with Europe, whole, free, and at peace, with looking at NATO as an entity, or it is quite possible, there's an academic debate, what happens if two NATO allies both declare Article 5 on one another? That's entertaining in an academic sense. It's actually quite dangerous in a practical sense. So it is, as you can imagine, understandably very difficult for these groups to have a real effect these days when they're under attack by the Turks. But it's also important from a Washington perspective that we figure out going forward what is our real priority. And I might add, from a defense perspective, this is an area in particular we're thinking about because the Defense Department divides these regions up. And I will just note that in recent weeks, I have continually heard statements from the commander of Central Command, as opposed to the commander of European Command, about how to think about what's going on there. That invariably is conveying a certain perspective.
Thank you. And I just want to ask Mr. Atani, you mentioned in your written testimony that de-escalating this Turkish-Kurdish situation is a critical priority. How do we do that?
So we have to trace how we got to this point and then rewind it a bit. We started by allying with a group that they see as their mortal enemy. Fine, rightly or wrongly, I could see the military rationale. Now the ISIS threat has become less urgent. So this is a chance, an opening for us to shift things around a bit and recalibrate the relationship. It doesn't mean letting them do what they are getting away with in Afrin. I think that's wrong too. But the truth of the matter is we're letting them get away with it because they let us get away with all the other stuff. So we don't really have any more leverage as long as we haven't changed or indicated that we want to change the balance of power in the north. Once we indicate that, then I think we are in a position to broker and put mutual pressure on the Kurds and the Turks to re-engage in peace talks. I mean, not too long ago, this was a serious prospect, and then it crumbled very quickly. But I think ultimately, if we want to make our presence in northeast Syria tenable, we need to get the Turks at least as passive acceptors of the situation.
I'll yield back that additional 40 seconds, but I hope that we do that in a way consistent with the obligation that we have to the Kurds who have been so helpful in this fight. Thank you, and I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Donovan of New York.
Thank you, Chairman. One of the disadvantage, or some people think advantage of being so low on the totem pole here, as most of the questions have already been asked. But let me just follow up on two things. Adam asked about the stockpile of chemical and biological weapons. Mr. Ambassador, you were talking about taking out their military. With the proliferation of these chemicals and biological warfare elements in places like North Korea, it could easily be purchased as well. Besides taking out the military, do economic sanctions to strangle Syria's ability to purchase these horrific weapons, are they also successful?
I want to be clear what I said, Congressman. I do not believe we can take out the stockpile. We can't. The only thing we can do is establish deterrence against the use of that stockpile. Frankly, Syria has so many sanctions on it, imposed by both Congress and by administrations dating back to the 1970s. When I was the American ambassador and I looked at this, it was a real spaghetti. So Syria's ability to buy things legally through the regular market is already severely hindered. That's why they do so much of their trade with Russia and Iran. I think the real question with respect to the chemical weapons issue is how do we sustain deterrence against their use by the Syrian government?
And because I think they might be calling the votes now, let me just ask you a follow-up also on the Syrian children that Adam brought up. You spoke about donor fatigue, and we find that throughout the world. I think America is a passionate and a compassionate nation who wants to come to the aid of people who are in need, but wants to see where that need is going to end at some point. I know this is difficult. Is there an end to this?
There's certainly no end in the immediate prospect. I want to underline, I think all of us have said that. There's no end in the immediate prospect. I think over time, the problem will grow less severe for two reasons. Number one, as some parts of the country grow more peaceful, I didn't say democratic, I said peaceful, some refugees will go back home. Farmers will go back to their lands because it'll be safe for them to farm again, hopefully. As cities are gradually, painfully, slowly rebuilt, some people will go home. Not everybody, but there will be less of a demand. The second factor will be, especially in countries like Turkey and Jordan, what steps will they take to integrate the remaining refugees into their broader society? That will be exceptionally difficult, especially for Jordan and also for Lebanon. In fact, right now, both countries are trying to kick Syrian refugees out, which is against international humanitarian law in any case. The Turks have gone some distance, and I saw a report that Jordan is beginning to give work permits to some Syrian refugees, and it's going to be that kind of thing. But, Congressman, frankly, this is going to take years and years and years.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Donovan. Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I'll be quick. I wish we had much more time because this is one of the most impressive, most intelligent panels I can recall. You have all touched on the fact that, or touched on the United States goals, strategy, and reflected on our capacity for a commitment to persist until we achieve our goals. But I was wondering in the context, and I may ask you just to submit this answer in writing because it is a big question, but Russia, Turkey, Iran are in this space with their own goals, strategy, and different commitments to stay, to succeed, and they are not going to not let us take our steps without reacting accordingly. So how will they respond to us? And I will leave that question because I know we're in urgent, and say if you have a chance to respond, I'd be grateful. And
I think that it's still all right.
Okay, then I will
We're good. We're good.
ask you for your answers. Dr. Carlin.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that very big question, which I will not do service to in 30 seconds. That said, so I think the Iranians right now are looking with a very curious eye. You have a more declared antagonistic posture from the administration, and I think in Tehran they're trying to figure out how will this actually get manifested right now? So they will be watching very closely what are the steps the United States takes. So in regard to Congressman Deutsch's question earlier about the sorts of things one might do, well, to the extent the United States wants to be more serious, we could do things like naming and shaming the Iranians for the sorts of steps they're taking. We could start pushing on flight searches like we did just after the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war. We could even take steps like we did in Iraq, where we started to arrest their affiliates. We saw this in 2007 in Iraq with Hamid the Mute. So I think the Iranians right now are waiting to watch. I think the Turks, and we understand the situation obviously with Turkey, which really has been turning away from the NATO model. We've seen it with their arms purchases with the Russians, et cetera. I think the Turkish view is very much, hey, America, what's your priority? Is it NATO or not? And as we're seeing, I think, from a lot of our European allies, they want it to be NATO, understandably. That's valid. For Russia, this is a bigger game. And if you read the National Defense Strategy that Secretary of Defense Mattis published about 2 weeks or so ago, the big emphasis in there is that the U.S. military's focus in the future is countering Russia and countering China. And so Moscow wants to know, does that mean in Europe? Does that mean in the Middle East? Thank you, sir.
Mr. Lister.
I would just say very briefly, I think I would kind of be quite cynical about framing a solution or an interim solution to Syria that is nationwide. One of the reasons why I framed some of my opening comments in terms of looking at specific pockets of the country is because I think that's the only way we can approach it. And in that sense, answering your question would require me to look at, well, the northeast and where does Turkey and Iran and Russia stand, and in the southwest, where do all those countries stand. But that is how I think that the United States should be looking at this. I don't think we have the means, and I also don't think we have the will to try to figure out a nationwide strategy for Syria. And I don't think one really necessarily exists. In fact, I don't think one necessarily exists for Russia and Iran either. So I think that's the starting point. I can submit something in writing to you in more detail.
That would be very much appreciated.
To treat the different dynamics individually, and thus individually with different countries.
Okay. Mr. Itani, Ambassador Ford.
Very briefly, Congressman, I think Russia, Iran, and Turkey all do not want a sustained U.S. military presence in eastern Syria that builds up a Syrian Kurdish militia, and they will all work in their different ways to impede that, which is why I think it is especially important for the Congress to demand of the administration what are the benchmarks for progress so that these local forces we're setting up are self-sufficient. What are the timelines? And if the administration can't provide that, then it is incumbent upon the Congress to decide if you are comfortable with an indefinite and vague U.S. military mission in Syria.
Thank you, and I'll yield back the balance of my 20 seconds.
Thank you so much. And now, Ambassador Wagner.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, witnesses. Dr. Carlin, I appreciated your review of Secretary Mattis's 2018 National Defense Strategy. You summarized that prioritizing preparation for potential conflicts with China and Russia will come at the expense of fighting today's wars against violent non-state actors. How do you think the Secretary ranks the Syrian conflict in his list of priorities, and to what extent do you think the Pentagon has the tools it needs to implement a serious policy in Syria beyond defeat of ISIS?
Thank you, ma'am. I think based on at least what I've seen publicly from the Defense Department, the conflict in Syria is no longer ranked terribly high. I think the view is that the future is about high-end conventional conflict, potentially with China, potentially with Russia. It's regaining the United States' qualitative military edge, which has been waning in recent years. And so I think the view is very much focused on countering ISIS, and then as that wraps up, shifting the U.S. focus. To the extent there is an issue on the table for the Pentagon beyond Russia and China, I would say it is probably Afghanistan, as we've seen with the troop surge, but that would really limit it. In terms of the tools, I think one of the challenges that we see going forward is much of the challenge in Syria is going to be much more in a whole-of-government sort of approach. So it's less kind of Defense Department, hard, kinetic tools. It's more the ability to work in terms of developing areas and potentially even diplomacy, depending on how one can build statelets of sort through which to start to exert some sort of influence.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Ford, thank you for your service in Syria. How can the U.S. regain leverage for peace talks and address the, should I say, rivalry between the Russian, Iran, Turkey, Astana talks and the UN-backed Geneva process?
In short, I don't think the Americans now can gain much leverage in the Geneva process or the Astana process because it's a war and we're not in the war. Or our war is against a different enemy, against Islamic extremists in the eastern part of the country. So we're not a player. In a war, military actions, military operations count for something. Stalin once asked, how many divisions does the Pope have? I think the Russians ask a similar question about the Americans now in Western Syria, which is the subject of the peace talks. So it's my short answer.
Thank you. Mr. Lister, you wrote that the president has big plans for Syria, but no real strategy. What would a serious strategy look like to enforce de-escalation areas and re-stabilize eastern Syria?
It's a good question. How long do you have?
Not long, sir.
You know what? I think what the previous Secretary of State, John Kerry, did with the Russians had a number of serious faults, largely out of the fact that we didn't have very much leverage. But I think the design was probably grudgingly largely right in the sense that because we don't have leverage, it has to be a multilateral effort. The problem with the current de-escalation regime, which was a Russian-led initiative, is that it was designed in such a way to de-escalate, not to cease fire. That in simultaneously with a complete American cessation of support to the opposition meant only one thing, that the regime was the only partner that would benefit from de-escalation. So the only solution to that, frankly speaking, if that's what we want, to have a fair ceasefire nationwide in Syria, and frankly, I don't think we're really going to get there, but if that is what we want, we have to have more skin in the game. And that might mean being more active in the northeast and more assertive, and that might mean creating the self-defense forces in the southwest that I talked about that would be defensive and would have a specific purpose there, not to attack the regime, but to defend. But we have to have more skin in the game if we want to have any role in creating any of this. And the same stands for the political process. We are, frankly speaking, laughed at because we don't have the skin in the game, and yet we make these big grand demands.
Thank you, Mr. Lister, for your candid testimony there. Mr. Itani, in my brief time here, how can the U.S. ensure that the Syrian regime and its Iranian allies do not get access to any Western stabilization and reconstruction assistance? Do you think the international community should help rebuild Syria, for instance?
Yes.
In 2 seconds.
It's a perfectly fair question. No, I don't think they should do that. And by that, I mean regime-held Syria, partly because I don't think it would work, because it would be pouring money into one of the most corrupt and dysfunctional political economies in the world, a political economy that was actually the initial cause of the war, or the uprising, before we even started talking about military uprising and regimes and militias and wars. It was about the political economy. So I think it would be a very bad investment, firstly. Second, we don't owe it to the regime to do it. I mean, it's not that I believe we should be starving the place, but I don't think it's the United States' duty to go and rebuild the place for him. And luckily, that is one of the things we as the United States have a lot of leverage over, which is international financial flows and the organizations that the people who want to rebuild the place are hoping will jump in. In fact, I'm actually more on the other extreme. I think we should be really worrying about the things that are already going on and where our money is going on the ground.
Because we do not want the Syrian regime or our Iranian allies to have access to to our assistance in that regard.
I don't believe we do, no.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much. Madam Chair, my time has expired, and I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And Mr. Lister, I want to focus in on your written testimony because it strikes me. I've had to listen at this table to my friends on the other side criticize the Obama administration for lacking a serious strategy. And yet, if I read your statement correctly, you've got two very pointed critiques of the Trump administration. One is, you say, the Trump administration has provided no evidence that it has developed a meaningful strategy to match its grand goals and has revealed no plans to deploy the resources that would be necessary to pursue them. Continuing to declare such goals without deploying even close to the necessary means to achieve them will only continue to erode American influence and credibility in the region. And then secondly, what struck me in your testimony, you went further. You said it's important to place this in a policy context. By lending its support, its public and private support, to a Russian-led initiative, meaning a ceasefire, designed specifically by the Russians to strengthen Assad's position yet further, the Trump administration has directly abetted Assad's survival, Iran's expansion and threat to Israel, and continued civil displacement. We've gone way beyond a critique of Obama's policy being feckless and not effective to actually abetting the very people and forces we want to see removed as our precondition for peace in Syria. That is your critique, if I understand it. I want to give you the opportunity to expand because that's one of the most powerful, cogent critiques of the Trump approach to Syria I have yet heard.
Well, thank you very much for summarizing some of the points I made. And I do stand
I actually didn't summarize. I read them.
Thank you. Well, thank you for reading them. And I stand entirely by them. I think that the fact remains that it's taken a year for the Trump administration to make the speech that was given 2 or 3 weeks ago. And as I said in my opening comments, the speech was a vision. It was a dream. As Mr. Atani said, we have nowhere near the means or the will to achieve the grand objectives that we set. And yes, frankly speaking, we don't know what went on behind closed doors when Trump met Vladimir Putin, and then shortly thereafter there was the announcement of total cessation of support to the opposition in Syria. It's very hard to see those two things as not having been more than a coincidence. And the impact on the ground is huge. Let's rewind a little bit of time and look at what did Russia do when it first intervened in Syria. 98%, I think, of its immediate airstrikes in the first few months of its operations targeted the groups we were supporting. They weren't targeting al-Qaeda, they weren't targeting ISIS, they weren't targeting other Islamists, they were supporting the vetted groups that we had been supporting since the end of 2012. What does that tell us? Those were the groups that Russia saw as the biggest explicit threat to the regime because they were more moderate, they were more representative of a portion of the population. So for the Trump administration to see support to every single group across the entire country that was opposing Assad and that we'd invested in since the end of 2012 sent only one message to Russia: you have a free hand. Now, we might be thinking something different from the Trump administration today, because if you read Secretary Tillerson's speech, it sounds completely different. But that's also the problem, frankly speaking, that we've seen from the Trump administration, is a complete lack of consistency. One day we're willing to work with the Russians, the next day we want to roll back the Russians. One day we want to attack Iran, the next day we accept Iran is where it is. Until we find a clear, clarified position, this is going to be the endless situation that U.S. policy is on Syria. In fact, we'll be losing leverage, losing credibility, as I say, and losing the kind of leverage we would need on the ground to meet any of the objectives we've set.
Well, I want to thank you in the time I have left for that analysis, and I think it's really important for the record. There are practical and very grave consequences from the President of the United States aiding and abetting Vladimir Putin's expansionist foreign policy at our expense and our allies. And you've just pointed out one quite clearly. We have aided and abetted the Assad regime as a consequence. So that bromance between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin is not a trivial one, and it's not without consequence. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Liu?
Thank you. Let me actually follow up on what Mr. Lister said. The President of the United States has stated that he thinks it is good to be unpredictable. My view is in foreign policy that that's just phenomenally stupid. And what you want is you want world leaders and other countries to actually know what U.S. foreign policy is, and that we don't flip back and forth and backtrack. And I just wanted to have you amplify a little more. Is it your view that being unpredictable is a good thing in foreign policy, or is it a bad thing?
There's an argument for and against, but my opinion is it's very much a bad thing. I think the way that our rivals in the Syrian context, Russia and Iran and the regime, look at it is it's not being unpredictable. It's not what I think the White House frequently calls it, which is strategic ambiguity. I think, frankly, it's just an excuse for indecision. And as I say, it did take us a year to make a speech about what we think we want Syria to be sometime down the line. We didn't give a strategy, we didn't give a timeline, we didn't show any means to get there. So I think the way our adversaries see it, which is I think the most important answer to your question, is it makes us look confused.
Thank you. I think it's actually even worse than that. It's not just unpredictable, it's that the same Trump administration will simultaneously put out exactly opposite viewpoints and take opposite actions. So I'll give you an example in the Middle East, as you all are familiar with their Saudi-led blockade on Qatar. And if you remember, you had Secretary of State Rex Tillerson publicly saying, no, 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 this is a bad idea, do not do economic blockade, it's basically an act of war. And then you had the President of the United States basically contradict him essentially the same day in the Rose Garden later, saying, taking credit sort of for doing this blockade. And then later you had the State Department selling billions of dollars of weapons to Qatar. So if someone's looking at that, they get their impression, I think, that the Trump administration has no idea what they're doing. So now let's talk a little bit about Syria. So in terms of Turkey, last July, the Center for Security Policy put out that Turkey reveals the location of American bases in Syria, and that the Pentagon was quite concerned about that. They didn't want that to happen. Turkey went ahead and did it anyways. We then see more recently in a Reuters report on January 31st that Turkey essentially is telling the U.S. that we should end our support for Kurdish YPG fighters or risk being targeted by Turkey. In fact, they had some pretty specific remarks that I view as threats to U.S. troops and our policy there. Given sort of Turkey's increasing, what's a good way to put it, ability to sort of take on the U.S. in ways we don't like and to sort of oppose our foreign policy interests, do you think it's time that we get some truth out there so we all understand that the Armenian genocide happened? It is a historical fact, and the only reason that that resolution has not been passed is because we want to keep relations with Turkey. Is it now time to pass that resolution and tell Turkey that, look, if you're going to take these actions against us, we're going to now tell the truth and do some things that you just might not like? And anyone on the panel can answer that.
I'll jump in only because I want to continue the same conversation we were having about Turkey. The thing is, if you want to judge anything that happened over the past 4 years or 3 years with Turkey, the context is really, really bizarre. We were fighting a proxy war against a terrorist group on their border using a proxy group that they view as a terrorist group and that is their existential enemy. So imagine, flip it around. Imagine we were to go to southern Syria to fight Al-Qaeda, and we were to use Hezbollah to do it. How do you think the Israelis would react? So as the Israelis say it, I'm not passing judgment on the militia in question, but as the Israelis would see it, that's how they would see it. So everything they do, I'm judging in that lens. Now, separately, something else is going on in Turkey that's kind of obfuscating everything, which is politically the place is taking a very worrying turn. And its leader is also taking a very worrying tone. I'm trying my best when I think about this from a policy sense, and I think everybody ought to try to disaggregate these two things. Turkey is not going to attack U.S. troops. That is Erdogan speaking. However, Turkey is going to do things like reveal our bases, because that is to the extent to which they can provoke and anger us. Now that ISIS is sort of behind us in the rearview mirror, I'm hoping we can continue with our lives and go back to some degree of normalcy and have a normal state-to-state relationship. But under those circumstances, I don't think it would be realistic to expect it to be anything but this hostile and bizarre.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. And I will recognize myself. Thank you. One of the more alarming situations unfolding in Syria is not only Iran's use of Shia militias to replicate Hezbollah's model, but Iran's attempt to solidify not only a theological bridge between Tehran, Baghdad, Damascus, and Beirut, but an actual land bridge, whether they can use the airport or not. In Sunni-majority areas in both Syria and Iraq, we've already seen Iran hard at work on this model, directing its proxy groups to fuel sectarian tensions, displacing Sunnis, and manipulating the demographics of the region for its own benefit. We've heard reports that Iran is directing Hezbollah to take root in areas where Sunnis have fled in Syria in order to make them Shia majority. It seems like Iran and its proxies are playing chess, thinking long-term, thinking strategically, while the U.S. and our partners are playing checkers and are failing to see the bigger picture. How can we in the U.S. and our partners work to counter Iran's efforts to alter Syria's demographics and establish its control and influence from Tehran to Beirut? Thank you, Faisal.
Happy to take this. So with respect to the chess and checkers analogy, I completely agree, Madam Chairwoman. I have nothing to say other than that. But on the issue of the demographics, something a bit stranger is going on in Syria. What seems to be happening is the regime is removing people it sees as hostile. Of course, most of them are Sunnis, but within the regime's eyes, you can also be a good Sunni. Actually, it's very useful to have good Sunnis, in the sense that these are the Sunnis that like the regime. That's one of the reasons he's still around. So they keep them generally more prosperous areas or middle class, and everybody else gets the sharp end of the stick. Hezbollah is taking areas in Syria that are important to its position in the mountainous areas between Lebanon and Syria. So it's expanded its military domain. Demographics are only kind of a small section of that problem. It's regime-driven on the demographic end, strategically and militarily driven on the Hezbollah, Iran end, I would put it that way. Because especially remember, there are not a lot of Shia in Syria. They're mostly Alawites, the people on the side of the regime.
Ma'am, could I add one point to that?
Yes, please.
You had mentioned Iraq, and what's interesting here is that the situation with Iraq and Iran is actually a lot more complicated now than I think we could say it was a few years ago. So I was in Iraq not long ago, including in Mosul. And what you see is much of the successful fight against ISIS militarily was conducted by militias, many of whom are supported by Iran. It was not conducted by most of the Iraqi military. So now you have Iranian-supported militias that are running, say, checkpoints in and out of Mosul, as I saw. But to make it even tougher, they have a bit of a victory that they can wave about.
Ambassador Ford.
One last point on this, Madam Chairwoman, briefly. It is difficult for me to imagine how we can successfully pressure Iran in Syria without being on the same wavelength as Turkey. Turkey and Iran are historic rivals, goes back hundreds of years. Turkey is the major Sunni power, if you will, in that part of the world, even more important in some ways than Saudi Arabia. I think to govern is also to set priorities. If it is the priority of the United States to use these Syrian Kurdish forces as a hammer against the Islamic State, then it is going to be much harder to work with Turkey on the Iran problem. On the other hand, if we decide that now the priority should be Iran, then we need to figure out how to come to some sort of an agreement with Turkey in a manner that meets their concerns about what they perceive as an existential threat emanating from the Kurdish areas of Syria.
Thank you again to all of our panelists for thoughtful analysis. And our subcommittee will be back next week with a hearing on the PA, unless we're in a shutdown, in which case, I don't know, rum and cokes at Ted's office, maybe. Thank you so much. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you.